Janavallabha Girivaradari Gopi Janavallabha Girivaradari Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjanam Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjanam Yamunatira Vanacharya Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Janavallabha Girivaradari Gopi Janavallabha Girivaradari Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Prabhupada. Jaya Jaya Prabhupada, 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 Prabhupada. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramhans Paraj Jakacharya Ashtottara Vishishta Divine Grace Abhay Charanaravinda Bhaktivedanta Goswami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai. Okay. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 So continuing on our Scientific Saturdays, today we're studying from the Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 2, Chapter 2, entitled The Lord in the Heart, and this is text 35, which we did study way back in October, and I promised we would return to the purport, because it's such a wonderful verse and purport. So, Bhagavan, Sarva, Bhuteshu, Bhagavan Sarva Bhuteshu, Lakshitaha, Svatmana, Hari, Lakshita Svatmana Hari, Drishyayar, Buddhi, Adibir, Drashta, Drishyayar Buddhyadibir Drashta, Lakshanayar, Anumapakai, Anumapakai, Lakshanayar Anumapakai, Bhagavan Sarva Bhuteshu, Lakshita Svatmana Hari, Drishyar Buddhyadibir Drashta, Lakshanayar Anumapakai, Bhagavan Sarva Bhuteshu, Lakshita Svatmana Hari, Drishyar Buddhyadibir Drashta, Lakshanayar Anumapakai,
Bhagavan Sarva Bhuteshu,
Bhagavan Sarva Bhuteshu,
Lakshita Svatmana Harihi,
Lakshita Svatmana Hari,
Drishyar Buddhyadibir Drashta,
Drishyar Buddhyadibir Drashta,
Lakshanar Anumapakai,
Lakshanar Anumapakai,
Bhagavan Sarva Bhuteshu,
Bhagavan Sarva Bhuteshu,
Lakshita Svatmana Harihi,
Lakshita Svatmana Hari Drishya Buddhyadibir Drashta Lakshanar Anumapakahai
Bhagavan Sarvabhuteshu
Bhagavan Sarvabhuteshu
Lakshita Svatmana Hari
Lakshita Svatmana Hari
Vishaya Buddhi Adibir Drasta
Tisharyadibir Drashta
Lakshanaya Anumapakai
Lakshanar Anumapakahai. Ladies. Bhagavan Sarvabhuteshu Lakshita Svatmana Hari Drishya Buddhyadibir Drashta Lakshanar Anumapakai Bhagavan Sarvabhuteshu
Lakshita Svatmana Hari
Lakshita Svatmana Hari
Drishya Buddhyadibir Drashta
Drishya Buddhyadibir Drashta
Lakshanar Anumapakai
Lakshanar Anumapakai
Bhagavan Sarvabhuteshu
Bhagavan Sarvabhuteshu
Lakshita Svatmana Hari
Lakshita Svatmana Hari Drishya Buddhyadibir Drashta Lakshanar Anumapakai Bhagavan, the personality of Godhead. Sarva, all. Bhuteshu, in the living entities. Lakshita, is visible. Swa-atmana, along with the self. Hari, the Lord. Drishyai, by what is seen. Buddhi adhibi, by intelligence. Drashta, one who sees. Lakshanai, by different signs. Anumapakai, by hypothesis. Translation. The personality of Godhead, Lord Shri Krishna, is in every living being along with the individual soul. And this fact is perceived and hypothesized in our acts of seeing and taking help from the intelligence. And I'm just going to turn to the second half of the purport, which we didn't read last time. And if you remember, this was the purport that Prabhupada explained how one can understand the difference between oneself, the body, and the differences between ourselves and our mind, and by the use of intelligence establish that the self is transcendental to the material elements. And then Prabhupada says, now we come to the point that the things which are seen by a little use of intelligence cannot be animate unless we accept someone as the user of or director of the intelligence. Intelligence gives one direction like some higher authority. And the living being cannot see or move or eat or do anything without the use of intelligence. When one fails to take advantage of intelligence, he becomes a deranged man. And so a living being is dependent on intelligence or the direction of a superior being. Such intelligence is all-pervading. Every living being has his intelligence, and this intelligence, being the direction of some higher authority, is just like a father giving direction to his son. The higher authority who is present and residing within every living being is the super self. At this point in our investigation, we may consider the following question. On the one hand, we realize that all our perceptions and activities are conditioned by arrangements of material nature. Yet we also ordinarily feel and say, I am perceiving, or I am doing. Therefore, we can say that our material senses of perception and action are moving because we are identifying the self with the material body, and that the superior principle of super-self is guiding and supplying us according to our desire. By taking advantage of the guidance of super-self in the form of intelligence, we can either continue to study or to put into practice our conclusion that I am not this body. Or we can choose to remain in the false material identification, fancying ourselves to be the possessors and doers. Our freedom consists in orientating our desire either toward the ignorant material conception or the true spiritual conception. We can easily attain to the true spiritual conception by recognizing the super-self, Paramatma, to be our friend and guide, and by dovetailing our intelligence with the superior intelligence of Paramatma. The super-self and the individual self are both spirit, and therefore the super-self and the individual self are both qualitatively one and distinct from matter. But the super-self and the individual self cannot be on an equal level, because the super-self gives direction or supplies intelligence, and the individual self follows the direction, and thus actions are performed properly. The individual is completely dependent on the direction of the super-self, because in every step the individual self follows the direction of the super-self in the matter of seeing, hearing, thinking, feeling, willing, etc. So far as common sense is concerned, we come to the conclusion that there are three identities, namely matter, spirit, and super-spirit. Now, if we go to the Bhagavad Gita, or the Vedic intelligence, we can further understand that all three identities, namely matter, individual spirit, and the super-spirit, are all dependent on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The super-self is a partial representation or plenary portion of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Bhagavad Gita affirms that the Supreme Personality of Godhead dominates all over the material world by his partial representation only. God is great, and he cannot be simply an order supplier of the individual selves. Therefore, the super-self cannot be a full representation of the Supreme Self, Purushottam, the absolute personality of Godhead. Realization of the super-self by the individual self is the beginning of self-realization, and by the process of such self-realization, one is able to realize the Supreme Personality of Godhead by intelligence, by the help of authorized scriptures, and principally by the grace of the Lord. The Bhagavad Gita is the preliminary conception of the personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna, and Srimad Bhagavatam is the further explanation of the science of Godhead. So if we stick to our determination and pray for the mercy of the director of intelligence sitting within the same bodily tree, like a bird sitting with another bird, as explained in the Upanishads, certainly the purport of the revealed information in the Vedas becomes clear to our vision. And there is no difficulty in realizing the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Vasudeva. The intelligent man, therefore, after many births of such use of intelligence, surrenders himself at the lotus feet of Vasudeva, as confirmed by the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 7, text 19. Bhagavan sarvabhuteshu lakshita svatmana hari drishya buddhyadibhir drashta lakshanayar anumapakai. The personality of Godhead, Lord Sri Krishna, is in every living being along with the individual soul. And this fact is perceived and hypothesized in our acts of seeing and taking help from the intelligence. Hare Krishna. Oh my God. Shri Gurave Namaha. This is such a powerful purport, and it gives the essence of how we are to apply our intelligence to understanding our situation in this world. And I'm going to link this purport with a little class I was asked to do for this afternoon, and because this fits in very well together. On a regular basis, we have been studying Sadhaputta Prabhu's book, Mechanistic and Non-Mechanistic Science. Are you all aware of that book? Get it. Get it immediately. Read it. Absorb it. But some of it's quite difficult because Sadhaputta is such a big brain that he does get technical at times. But it is actually an incredible dissertation in explaining the philosophy of Bhagavatam, and so much is related to this particular purport. So each fortnight we've been studying a different chapter, and the chapter that I take as providential handed to me was the chapter 7, which was called On Inspiration. And this is really interesting. How many of you have seen the Origins magazine? Again, track one down. Again, these are publications that the BBT did in the early 80s. And unfortunately, ISKCON has not bettered them since. But they do need all the arguments, all the points that are made there are valid still. They will always be valid. But perhaps some of the examples and things need certain updating. So in both that, Sadhaputta introduces this idea of inspiration by where do ideas come from? You see, and he was looking at in art, in science, in music. And I'll give you a music example to start with. Where do ideas come from? Well, we have a personal connection with the Beatles, going back to the 1960s. And they were very kind to Srila Prabhupada. And before meeting Prabhupada, one day Paul McCartney had a dream. And in that dream, he heard a melody. And he woke up the next morning thinking, where did that come from? I don't know that song, do I? And he immediately went and on the piano and just learnt it, made sure he knew it. Better than that. I don't know if you recognize it. And he wondered, where is it? Huh? Yesterday. And he wondered, where did this come? I must have heard it from someone else, because they were listening to a lot of stuff. So he phoned up all his friends, and he phoned up different stars and singers and people, and asked them, do you know this tune? No, never heard that one. So eventually he understood that this actually had just appeared in his head. He had no words for it. At that time, they used to call it scrambled eggs, because that seemed to fit. So this was inspiration. And it's not rare. What Sadhaputta explains is that whenever there is a major advancement on something special, something that really captures the public eye in art or music, or it makes an advance in science or mathematics, it's not something that is carefully calculated, oh, I know this, and then I know this, and then I know, you know. It's not like that. It comes to people very quickly. Inspiration. And he gives a number of examples. Of course, you probably all know the story of Archimedes. You know, Eureka, exactly. You know, he was given the task by the king, was his name Helion? Anyway, the king of Syracuse. The king had given a bunch of gold to a goldsmith and said, please make me a really nice gold crown. The goldsmith comes back and gives him a crown. And the king's thinking, I'm not sure if he used all the gold in this. I think he may have mixed it with silver and cheated me. So he told Archimedes, you've got to find out if this crown is actually just made of gold or whether it's a mixture of silver. But you're not allowed to damage it. You're not allowed to bore a hole or do anything like that in it. So Archimedes kind of goes away and he's thinking, he can't come to a conclusion. He can't figure it out. Because he knew that silver weighed less than gold. So he understood that bit. But that only was helpful if you knew how to figure out what the volume of the crown was. Now, if something is a simple shape, a square or a circle, you know, ball, you can work out the volume. But if something is a complex shape like a crown, how do you figure out the volume that's there? And he was thinking, so by his own calculation, he couldn't come to it. So he just thought, you know, I'm going to the public baths. And he goes in, jumps in the bath, water spills out, and he goes, Eureka! That's what it is.
Yeah.
You know, the water that is displaced equals the volume of what I put into the water. So that way we can figure out exactly the thing. So inspiration. So this is, Sariputta wants to use inspiration. Now he has several purposes in doing this. The first one is that inspiration helps to corroborate this point that mind and consciousness, conscious experience, cannot be mechanistic, can't be material. It cannot just be a product of the brain. Because how does the brain come up with, in something like inspiration, a whole new idea? And we'll analyze that in a few minutes. The second point is to introduce, well, where does inspiration then come from if it's not from the brain? And this brings in the role of intelligence, as mentioned in the early part of this purport, that intelligence is the form, direction of the supersoul. So it brings in the concept of non-material intelligence, but links that non-material intelligence to the intelligence of supersoul. That supersoul is helping us as the form direction of our own intelligence. It's not that supersoul is intelligence, but the supersoul connects with us by being the form direction of our intelligence. And then he uses this to explain the conundrum that Western philosophy has. Eastern philosophy never really bothered, thought this was a problem because it understands the nature of transcendental substance, Brahman, and that matter is simply an evolute of Brahman. But Western philosophy, because it takes matter as the real stuff and thinks all the other things like mind and consciousness must be, you know, some airy-fairy things, well then how can airy-fairy stuff affect real stuff? They've got it completely the wrong way round. But that's their problem. So until they hear a solution for that, they kind of remain fixed in their concept that matter is the all-in-all. So Sariputta also uses this understanding of supersoul, and we've mentioned, I think, in previous classes also, that it is the supersoul which connects the desires of the living entity with the workings of our bodies, and of course then the interaction we have with the world. So all these points just coming from the use of this kind of interesting experience of inspiration. I should ask, how many of you feel that at some point you've had some moment of experience, of inspiration? That, somehow you got some information from somewhere. Where did that come from? Happens on Sankirtan, doesn't it? You hear yourself saying something and you go, where did that come from? How did I know that? Or all sorts of things. And those who work with the deities, I'm sure, also have it. I remember one time on Sankirtan, I was cultivating a family for a large donation, and the guy was really tricky. Happens that he was a goldsmith also. There's something about them, obviously, they're just crooks. But somehow or other, he'd become, we thought he'd become willing to kind of give a donation. So he gave me a cheque for £5,000. That was a lot of money way back. And finally, I thought, this is great. Krishna's been, bless this guy. And I brought the cheque to the temple room and laid it on the hundi like that for the pleasure of the deities. And I sat down and just, kind of basking in the success of this. And then I heard this voice saying, have a look at that cheque you've just given me. Have another look at it. I went, what? Have a look at that cheque. Okay. I looked at the cheque. He hadn't signed it. Oh. So Krishna was basically saying, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Coming, presenting this, very pleased with yourself, but actually you hadn't checked. So sometimes inspiration gives us something positive, and sometimes it's to tell us when we've been a little foolish. But the aspects that Satiputta analyzes regarding inspiration, that they are sudden, unexpected. They don't come about by consciously working things through step by step by step by step, and then bang. And he gives examples of Mozart, who would say that actually the music just comes to me all at once, and I just hear it all in one go. So how is the brain able to do that? And of course, Satiputta, being a mathematician himself, gave a lot of mathematical examples, and they were important because with other examples such as Paul McCartney thinking up yesterday, think, well, yeah, maybe there's only there's only 12 notes to play with on the scale, maybe the brain put them together in some way. That's not an awful lot. Whereas in mathematics, there are a lot of different symbols, a lot of different steps to any formula. And we're not talking about 2 + 2 = 4. We're not talking about the simple things that you can work out. Small, simple stuff, routine, yeah, you can work out step by step. We were looking the other day at a proof by Bhaskar, who was a Vedic astronomer, for his proof for Pythagoras' theorem. Really, very simple, very simple. Very clever, but worked out bit by bit by bit. Actually, I believe even Pythagoras got it by looking at some tiles and just went, bang, that's it. That's how it works. Anyway, but big proofs in later years, mathematics is pretty complex stuff now, and all the time new ideas are coming in and new ways of manipulating mathematical concepts are increasing. So Satiputta gives examples from Karl Gauss, I think German, Henri Poincaré, Galois, and Bernhard Riemann, another German mathematician. And he shows how these guys were coming up with theories, and in several cases they had just written the theory. This works like this, and they'd given no justification. Now, even if you do a maths example at school, a maths exam, you're told you can't just write the answer, can you? You're meant to show you're working. How did you get there? To show that you actually understood and not just guessing. And these guys are coming up with theorems that are mind-blowing, that no one has ever heard of before. And they're just writing it down. Sometimes in a notebook, sometimes in a letter. I think it was Galois wrote a letter, and then he died very young, actually, just after that. And people are looking at these theorems thinking, how are these right? And some of them could not be solved or proved or verified until much later. Until there was other newer ideas in mathematics that could be used to solve those theorems. And those new ideas weren't even known to the people who wrote the theorems. So where does all this intelligence come from? And these are complex things. Some of them take pages and pages and, volumes of mathematical steps in order to get them. So Sariputta, being a mathematician, does a calculation. He says, if you look at the brain and you look at how many connections can be made, between neurons to create an algorithm that could calculate a theorem. He said, we can pretty well work out that possibly the brain is capable of 10 to the 46 calculations, or steps in like a little decision tree, where if you go here, should we do 1 or 2? 1 or 2. 10 to the 46, that's a huge number.
In a second.
Huh?
In a second.
Yeah, something. I think he's doing it in an angstrom moment or something. It's he's getting right down to the, and he's trying to be generous. But then he analyzes. But if you have just say 333 steps in a mathematical proof, which isn't that many for these type of things, that would take 10 to the 100 kind of calculations in the brain. And the brain isn't just mathematically it couldn't come up with it by random chance. That was the point. And then the question is, well, if there was an algorithm in the brain that could generate a mathematical theorem that the person didn't seem to know about, where did that come from? How is it encoded in there? Is it genetic? Why would there be a genetic code for an algorithm for a theorem that no one's ever used? How is that going to get passed down? By so-called evolutionary theory, anything that is a genetic kind of thing that's going to get passed down has to have some kind of value or purpose. So that's coming from our ancestors, supposedly cavemen who working out how many prime numbers would there be, in the no, it's not no use to the mathematicians, even his parents, never mind any of ancestors. And if we then take the neuroscience idea that was it neurons that fire together, wire together. So which isn't completely true, but it's something they try and say to establish kind of memory. She's looking us about the ability, she should go on the taiki jai. So could that be, could we use neuroscience? But how have these neurons fired together to produce this theorem? when the person has never thought about the theorem in that way. Because this is the interesting thing, that often these mathematicians have worked on this theorem or worked on an idea to to find a solution to something and just can't get it. And then, bang, it comes to them, often when they're not thinking about it. They do something else and then suddenly, oh yeah. And it always involves a kind of whole new way of looking at it. It's just a different way of seeing the question, the problem, the solution. And it doesn't come that, oh, maybe if I tried adding this and this together. It comes like, bang. The solution just seems complete, like Mozart hearing the music in one complete symphony, practically. So they just take it. That's it. It's correct. It's final. It's like they know something that they couldn't have known before. And Sariputta also explains that you can't get AI to do this. Have any of you tried ChatGPT?
Yes.
Pretty useless, isn't it? It's good for some things. Frankly, it's now a better search thing than Google and the other ones. But if you ask it anything complex, I had a big argument with it the other day. I was asking it to study the works of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada and tell me if Prabhupada makes any distinction between the words Jagat and Brahmanda. The Brahmanda being the universal egg, and Jagat generally we translate as universe. We translate both as universe. And oh boy, it was bad. And I tried to correct it. And he said, oh yeah, you're right, I was wrong. And then said, so what are you going to tell me now? And he went back and told me the same thing again that it told me the first time that was wrong. So you can't get anything new from it. And you can't even get a good understanding of things that aren't new. And you can never tell if it's right or not. Whereas one of the aspects that is identified in this phenomenon of inspiration is that there is subtle selection needed, subtle recognition needed. You almost have to have an aesthetic, emotional appreciation in order to see that is the correct solution. So Sariputta uses this to demonstrate that it is impossible to explain this phenomenon of inspiration through a mechanistic process of what the brain can do, of what genetics can do, just what matter can do. It doesn't work. This is an aspect of human experience that defies the mechanistic explanation. Now, of course, the other points that we have previously made in regard to mind, qualia, you remember, and all those things, they also defy very nicely that matter is responsible for conscious experience. But what inspiration does, which is helpful, is it raises the question that I'm getting information that my brain could not have calculated. So where does that come from? And this allows Sariputta then to postulate that not only is the individual self a conscious entity, not only is that conscious entity distinct from mind and body, but that the conscious self is gaining some extra information and help in the form of intelligence being supervised and assisted by the super self. And Prabhupada uses that, uses several terms here. He's really stressing it, super consciousness, super spirit, super self, supreme, to indicate this role of the Paramatma as intelligence as guiding our intelligence. So, even Poincaré wrote a famous book called Science and Hypothesis, and in it he actually points out that scientific knowledge is always uncertain for various reasons, and it's a very good analysis. And he also muses on this aspect of inspiration because he himself had several kind of incidents where he knew he was getting some kind of extra guidance, and he was thinking, well, there must be a subliminal self, someone, because that's the whole thing. The conscious person isn't aware of any of the steps coming to the conclusion. They only hear the conclusion. How is that? Who's the thing doing the thinking? So he thinks there must be a subliminal self. And of course there's lots of philosophies in psychology about the unconscious mind. And to some degree that is correct. The mind is a thing that generates. It's your chat GPT. It's your AI program looking at things and cranking solutions and ideas. But have you any idea that it's telling you the right thing? No. You can't rely on it one little bit. You always need to be checking. Is my mind telling me the right thing on this? Is it feeding me the right desire, the right motivation, the right kind of insight, the right emotion in this situation? No. But it is a kind of, it's an automaton, I think is the word. Automaton, meaning that it's something that has it doesn't have life, but has its own way of working. It is a kind of subliminal self. Now, Poincaré then said, well, this subliminal self must be greater. Now, the mind is not greater than consciousness. And the mind is not conscious. So what makes it able to give us stuff that makes it seem like it's greater? That's what intelligence is. That's what Supersoul is providing. So Supersoul connected with intelligence, and intelligence connecting, as Prabhupada said, in the matter of the individual is completely dependent on the direction of the super self, because in every step the individual self follows the direction of the super self in the matter of seeing, hearing, thinking, feeling, willing. So that's there. So this then brings up, gives us a model that we have individual consciousness, we have super consciousness, or the super spirit, super self, universal consciousness, all these different kind of terms really being used for this feature of Paramatma. And it is facilitating interaction of the Atma with its body. So the question that was raised by, I think it was Princess Elizabeth to Descartes, she said, okay, you've got a very interesting theory about this dualistic idea that there, there's spirit and there's matter, or mind and matter. So how do the two interact? She just raised a very simple question, and that's flummoxed all of Western philosophy for the next. But the answer is that the individual soul does not control matter. We do not manipulate matter. And Sadhuputta refers to various verses from the Bhagavad Gita, because part of his project is to show that this model of consciousness and superconsciousness that is given in the Bhagavad Gita is actually the most natural, reasonable explanation for everything we see. So he quotes the various verses that we are not the doer. Let me give you, I got a couple of them here. Oh no, I didn't. There was another. 327, which, anyone know that one? Prakriti. Huh?
Which is? The living entity who
he thinks he's the doer, but actually everything is carried out by the three modes of material nature.
Exactly. You know, and there are various versions of that throughout the Gita. The Gita is very clear. We're not the doer. We think we're the doer. We're pretty well convinced we're the doer. And it seems that whenever I want to do something, things happen. I seem to be in control of my basic activities, right? But actually, I'm not. I desire to do those, but that desire is taken by Supersoul and translated into the information of the three modes, and the three modes then arrange that everything happens. So that is the kind of mechanism by which consciousness of the individual interacts with the world. And Prabhupada quotes the verse, Maya kshena prakriti suyate sacharacharam, that this material energy is my energy. Maya prakriti, Krishna says. So it's Krishna's energy. He can do whatever he likes with it. He's the manipulator of it. It's not our energy. We're allowed to play within it. But it's Krishna's energy. Therefore, Krishna is the one doing the manipulating. And he's doing that in his feature of Paramatma. Reading our desires, facilitating them by engaging our body, by seeing things happen. So this provides the mechanism by which the world works. And Sadhuputta takes it to a next level. He says, well, actually, this gives us a hierarchy of laws of nature. Because we can look at the world and we can see, you know, if I have something and I drop it, things seem to work in a particular way. And we can analyze the speed at which it drops, the acceleration, and we can give calculations, you know. So there's lots of things we can calculate. So the world does seem to work, and we're able to apply certain, what we call laws, but basically they're just ways of modeling how the world is behaving. We call them laws because they help us then say, well, if it happened then, it's going to happen again, like that. And therefore I can give some predictions, and therefore I can manipulate the world in a particular way. So we call them laws, and they're very simple. So that's the base level by which the world seems to be operating. It's fulfilling our interest in exploiting it, controlling it, manipulating it, enjoying it. That's been facilitated by our idea that this world has laws which I can dominate and dominate nature. But then there's a higher level, because although things are being facilitated by the Supersoul, it doesn't seem to be even. Not everyone gets the same inspiration. Not everyone gets the same experiences. So there must be something else controlling the circumstances in which our desires are being fulfilled. And this brings us to a kind of higher order set of laws, which Sadhuputta identifies as the laws of karma. Laws which are complex and control the living entity's behavior, particularly human behavior. So Supersoul is facilitating our desires, but facilitating our desires according to what we deserve. So desire and deserve kind of go together. And that's a whole, of course, the laws of karma are a whole subject. And when basically you've got the simple laws that science can look at, no problem. Nothing is, we're not saying you have to reject the use of science to look at those laws, but they don't tell you the whys, the circumstances that we're all in. They don't tell you anything about the higher order laws of karma. And then above that, above the laws of karma, there is the direct interaction and activities of the super self. That's a different thing. Now, the laws of karma work kind of legalistically. You've done this is the reaction you're going to get. You know, you did this nice thing, this is the reward you're going to get. It's kind of legalistic, it's impersonal. It works. Because that's the only way to be fair to general people in the material consciousness. No favoritism in that respect. The laws of karma work. But Krishna does say, and this is a big subject in the Bhagavatam, isn't it? It appears all the time. Is Krishna being unfair to the non-devotees? Is he being too kind, too generous, always favouring the devotees? Sometimes it does appear like that. I was just reading the story of Bali Maharaj surrendering, and there Bali Maharaj is actually coming to the conclusion, no, it's the other way around. Actually, he's favouring me as a demon better. Because the demigods are always proud of and puffed up from their opulence. And he doesn't correct that. Whereas I was puffed up by my opulence. And look what Vamana has done to me. He's now taken all my possessions, stripped me of everything, and now I'm bound up by the ropes of Varuna. So he has been more kind to me and showing more favour than he does to the demigods. So sometimes, that's the analysis of a devotee, of course. A devotee who just appreciates that Krishna always acts in the best interest all the time. There's no favoritism, really. It's just Krishna reciprocating with bhakti. And that's, Sadhupati uses this term, that the supreme, the highest position of how the world works is ultimately, in the mind of God, the unconstrained will of the Supreme. And I think he's borrowed that term from somewhere. I don't think we've ever heard Prabhupada use that particular phrase, unconstrained will of the Supreme. I think it's probably a theological term, meaning that God can do whatever he likes. Ultimately, that has to be God's position. That there is nothing stopping God doing anything. He not only can think anything and will anything, he can make anything happen, unconstrained. That's not our situation. We're highly constrained in our will. Actually, our will, is pretty wild. Our will is even to become God, if we go that route. But it's highly constrained in terms of what we'll be able to achieve. But the unconstrained will. Now, for some people, for those who are not devotees, that's frightening. You're telling me that there is an entity of super consciousness with unconstrained will? He can just do anything he likes to any of us? It sounds random, it sounds capricious, it's just whatever he desires. It sounds very dangerous. Why? Because I know that if I was in that position, you're all in trouble. That would be dangerous. We know what we're like, therefore we don't trust that any other conscious being could actually be trusted with unconstrained will. And actually it's even a tough journey for the devotees. Trusting Krishna. We come and we surrender to Krishna.